This video is a continuation of the previous video on epithelia, going through connective tissues, muscle, and neural tissue. So there are four tissues in the adult body, and the tissue level of organization is important to understand before we start talking about organs and systems. Connective tissue, well, they're hard to talk about because here is a classic connective tissue. Now, in epithelia, if you want to describe the epithelia, you really only have to talk about the cells. But here we have to talk about a number of things, not just the cells which we see here, but also there are protein fibers around the cells. There's something filling in the space known as a ground substance. And so one of the things I ask my students to do is to look at this picture, and could you describe it just by talking about the cells? With epithelia, you can, but with this connective tissue, you can't. Now, also one of the things we see that's odd here is that connective tissues can have very specialized cells. Now, you might argue, well, aren't all cells special? Yes, they are. All cells are special. But in epithelial tissues, all of the cells which touch each other, they're essentially the same. Maybe at the bottom layer of the epithelia, the cells are more cuboidal and they're more squamous or flatter up at the apical surface. Whereas here's a fibroblast which is making collagen. Here's an adipose cell which is storing fat. Here is a macrophage. Here is a lymphocyte. You can have cells which are completely unrelated to each other with completely different embryological origins, completely different functions. So not only do we have cells, but very specialized cells. This cell is very different from that one, which is very different from that one. So that's something that we see in connective tissue. Also notice that they don't have to touch each other. All right, and so in epithelia, you have cells with junctions forming a barrier. That is not the case here. But also notice these proteins. And then you might say, once again, I'm not that impressed. Don't all cells make protein? Yes, they do. But this protein is actually now on the outside of cells. It is an extracellular protein fiber. So all cells make proteins on the inside, but these are now producing proteins on the outside, which are a prominent part of the tissue. And then a final question is, what is filling in the spaces here? Is it water, as is the case in, say, blood or lymph? Is it something solid in the case of, say, bone or cartilage? Or is it a syrupy ground substance in what are known as the connective tissue proper groups, hyaluronic acid and other things? Well, that would make a difference if this was water, if it was something solid, if it was syrupy. And so in order to describe this, you have to describe three things: the specialized cells, the extracellular protein fibers, and the ground substance. And that's not just not the case with epithelia. Let me say a few words about the fibers, which one we can find before I go into individual connective tissues, where we can then pursue these further. In this one connective tissue here called areolar connective tissue, you can actually see that there are different types of extracellular protein fibers. Some are more of a red color and wider, so they're thicker. But then you also see some narrower ones. The wider ones are collagen, which is strong but flexible, and the most abundant protein in your body. So your tendons are primarily all collagen. Your ligaments are all collagen. The dermis of your skin is mostly collagen, but bone and cartilage can be a quarter collagen or more. You have a lot of collagen in your body. But then there are other fibers as well. There are the narrower reticular fibers, which we find abundantly in the immune system's tissues, so the spleen, lymph nodes, and the like, but also present in other areas as well, like basement membranes. And then you can also find elastic fibers, which have a great ability to stretch up to 1.5 times their original length. So we have it in our skin, in the lungs, which need to expand, in blood vessels, especially elastic arteries, which need to expand. And so there are a variety of these extracellular protein fibers. Now, this is perhaps a little bit outside the frame in this course, but collagen is not only important in humans, it's found in fungi. It is the most abundant protein in all animals, including the simplest ones. So whether we're talking about sponges, jellyfish, arthropods, collagen is the most abundant protein in bodies. Here you see it in the dermis of human skin, or in tendons and ligaments, etc. So collagen is in so many places. Now, actually, we have a couple of different collagen genes, a handful of them, and they make a helix. But to make the collagen protein, you actually need 3 helices. And so because there are different collagen proteins, similar but different, encoded by different genes, that means that then we can make different kinds of collagen. Look, this kind of collagen is a triple helix made from one single protein, just 3 alpha helices, where you could have 2 of the same and 1 being different, or you could have all 3 of them being different. And so there are different kinds of collagen encoded by different genes in the human genome, so I have a video going through that. We then assemble what's known as pro-collagen by connective tissue cells called fibroblasts. All right, so we will see that, for example, here you look at a tendon, and all you're really looking at is collagen and the nuclei of the fibroblast cells, which are making the collagen. So under the microscope, tendons, ligaments, that's a lot of what you would see. So the fibroblasts, they're making a protein which then gets released from their cells, where enzymes can then join the helices and then form longer chains. And so outside cells then, you have collagen fibrils then assembling to form collagen fibers. And, so I go through a bit of that. Once again, I'm going to jump back to talking about tissues, but since this is the most abundant protein in our body, if anyone wanted to pursue further how the collagen of the tendon is made, or the collagen of this that dense irregular tissue, then by all means. Okay. But getting back here, I know my students, one of the challenges they face, in addition to learning a little bit about connective tissues in general, to then go to lab and be able to identify them. So what I'd like to do is run through a number of different connective tissues, then highlight some of the features of each, but then along the way, some of the general features that all connective tissues share, may come true, or may become apparent. So the connective tissue that I had used before is what is known as areolar connective tissue. It's very commonly used as a packing material. So you can find it lots of places. So the superficial part of the dermis for the skin, for example, but many other areas as well. Here you see a mast cell, which can induce inflammation. So whenever something which induces the inflammatory response binds to antibodies which can attach to mast cells, they can release these granules. And so areolar connective tissue can thus participate in inflammatory responses. Many of the connective tissue cells are so very specialized, and that's evident here. This is adipose tissue. This is a fat cell and adipocyte. Now, what we see in the middle is just a big chunk of triglyceride, a big inclusion of triglyceride in the center of the cell. And then most of what we consider to be the cell then is then pushed to the outside, like the nucleus, the cytoplasm, the mitochondria, etc. Adipose is very important for insulation to help us keep warm. It's very important in packing material. An adipose capsule holds the kidneys in place. Adipose can be present in places like the joints where they help to absorb shock. But a primary function is that this triglyceride serves as an energy store, which we can then use when needed, when we're asleep, or if it's been a while since we've eaten. We now understand that adipose actually makes a number of hormones, which then means that as we gain weight, the hormones that our body makes, like leptin, then change. And that's significant because these hormones can have roles in cardiovascular disease, a number of cancers, asthma, reproductive abnormalities, etc. So adipose is a connective tissue as well. So now there would be collagen fibers outside adipose, and the ground substance is syrupy. A lot of fibers aren't evident unless they are separately stained for. So for example, when we look at bone soon, bone has extracellular protein fibers in there as well, but you would have to stain for them separately. Now, collagen is not the only extracellular protein fiber, so there are also then elastic fibers, which are present in places where we need to stretch, like our skin can stretch and pop back to its original shape. And this is an elastic artery. The arteries near the heart need to be able to stretch every time the heart beats and then return to their original shape. And when we feel a pulse, that's actually a wave of elastic recoil passing over arteries. So elastic fibers can stretch and return to their original shape. If you were trying to identify these, very often elastic arteries are nice to look at under the microscope. And, some people will describe it as looking like the edges of lasagna noodles, which are stained purple. And so if you see a lot of those wavy lines, that would be elastic connective tissue. Here you can see other places where elastic fibers can be, such as vocal cords, inside bronchioles and respiratory passageways, which need to stretch, and other areas as well. And here's a second video where I have elastic connective tissue, and you can see all of the elastic fibers once again staining purple. And so it ends with emphysema, which, as we lose alveoli, we lose elastic fibers as well, and this then limits the ability that the lungs can expand. Here you can see a tendon. Now, what you're looking at first is a skeletal muscle cell, which we'll get to in a little bit. But skeletal muscle cells are wrapped in collagen fibers. And then these collagen fibers can form these tendons, which can say then anchor the muscle to the bone. So here you can see a tendon. Notice all the collagen fibers, these thick red fibers, but also then the nuclei of the fibroblasts, which are synthesizing the procollagen, which once again becomes the collagen of the tendon. So here, once again, you can see the skeletal muscle fiber, and then the collagen fibers in the tendon, and those dark spots there, those are the nuclei of the fibroblasts, which are making the collagen. So once again, collagen is the most abundant protein in our body. Tendons and ligaments are almost entirely collagen, but we find it elsewhere as well. Collagen wraps muscles. Collagen is a major component of bone, once again, as I had said. And in this next video, in addition to a tendon with all of its collagen fibers, there's also the image of a ligament. So once again, if a quarter of bone, and even more so cartilage, can be collagen, then very often what connects them are extensions from these collagen fibers. So here, once again, there are fibroblasts, the dark nuclei. They are the ones making the collagen. And then you can find collagen elsewhere as well, such as in fibrous connective tissue. Now, when we look at collagen fibers, sometimes all of the collagen fibers are running in one direction, right? So in a tendon or a ligament, when one sees collagen, they're all kind of going, in one direction, which makes sense because, when we flex our arms, the forces are always coming just from, one primary plane. And so the collagen fibers are oriented in this sense. It is what is known as a regular connective tissue. So a tendon or a ligament would be an example of a dense, regular connective tissue because the collagen fibers are going in the same direction. However, if you were to look at the dermis of your skin, here you can see collagen fibers going in all sorts of different directions. A joke I make in class is, if you think of, relatives that you might have had when you were growing up, they might have grabbed your cheek and said, "Oh, you're so cute." But then the next time, "Oh, you're so cute," but pulled from a different direction or a different direction. So the dermis of your skin knows it's going to, be pulled upon, but it doesn't know in which direction. So there have to be collagen fibers going every which way. One's going this way, one's kind of coming right at the screen, etc. And this gives it an irregular appearance because the collagen fibers are not all oriented together. This is then dense, irregular connective tissue. Once again, mostly collagen for strength, but a strength in different directions. So, we could distinguish between dense regular connective tissue and irregular connective tissue. There is a third type of fiber known as reticular fibers. They tend to be thin, and we find them a great deal in the cells of the lymphatic, or the tissues of the lymphatic system. So when you look at a lymph node or the spleen, for example, a lot of reticular fibers, and say in reticular tissue, what you essentially see are white blood cells can actually move along these fibers looking for problems like bacteria, bacterial toxins, cancer cells, signs of infection. So a lot of what some lymphatic tissues attempt to do is to create kind of like a spider web so that fluid flows through them, but attached to more or less the spider web of fibers are these cells which are now monitoring the area for for signs of trouble, and they can then mount an immune response if there is trouble. Okay. All of the tissues that I just mentioned, they were connective tissues, but they did not have a watery ground substance. They did not have a solid ground substance like is evident here. Their ground substance was kind of syrupy, thick. Now that's actually helpful because, so let's say, for example, you get an infection. Having a thick, syrupy ground substance actually makes it more difficult for microbes to move. So the hyaluronic acid and other things which make up this ground substance, that's important. Here you can see an example of a solid ground substance. This is bone. Now, I don't mean to describe bone fully because there's a chapter on the skeletal system and that starts off with bone tissue. So that's obviously more appropriately dealt with there. So let me just kind of focus here on the connective tissue aspects. So bone is alive. We often forget that because, if we analyze bone in lab, you're looking at the dead remnants of bone. You're not, looking at, living bone. Each of these spaces here has bone cells in them. And remember that connective tissues can have a variety of specialized cells. So here, bone, for example, can have a number of different cell types: osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts, osteoprogenitor cells. So there can be a variety of bone cells, and here you can see some here. Now, cartilage, which I'll mention next, has no blood supply, whereas bone does. And so while all epithelia is avascular, most connective tissues are vascular, but there are exceptions like cartilage. You can't see collagen fibers here. You would have to then decalcify the bone. So right here, there is a solid ground substance made of calcium salts, of calcium salt mix known as hydroxyapatite. And there are also then collagen fibers here as well. If it was just this mix of calcium salts, then bone would be brittle like a seashell. If there was only collagen, then bone would be too flexible. And so it's the two together which give it, this wonderful strength that of steel reinforced concrete. So just very quickly, here's a video that would also be applicable in that tissue on bone tissue. But if you were to take the calcium salts out of bone, you would still see stuff, right? So bone is not just, hydroxyapatite. There are these collagen fibers. And once again, bone would be much more brittle if the collagen wasn't there. Now, we don't see the collagen because we'd have to stain for it separately. But once again, bone is a connective tissue. So it has living cells, specialized cells. It has an extracellular set of proteins, and then also it has this ground substance. Now, cartilage also has a solid ground substance. It's different from bone. It's more of a gel known as chondroitin sulfate. There are specialized cells here. So there is cells called chondroblasts and chondrocytes, once again, in the bone tissue chapter that can be described in greater detail. Cartilage, unlike bone, is avascular. And we split cartilage into different kinds. So for example, the most common kind in our body is what's called hyaline cartilage. Examples of this would be what connects the ribs to the sternum, or the cartilage of the larynx and the trachea, or what's at the end of bones where they contact each other. So here, when you look at the trachea, what you're looking at here is a solid connective tissue. Look, there's stuff there. All right, that's not empty space, that's solid, there's something there. There are these cells. Once again, cartilage is a living tissue. There are cells. They're living in little spaces they've helped make for themselves, known as lacunae. And there are collagen fibers throughout. So once again, collagen is the most abundant protein in the body. And even if we don't see it in a solid connective tissue like bone or cartilage, doesn't mean that it isn't there. And so there are different types of cells in cartilage, both chondroblasts. And the term blast is the term we use for immature cells in a tissue that's maybe expanding. Whereas then chondrocytes would be the mature cells, which are, say, maintaining the tissue. Once again, as these chondroblasts are making the chondroitin sulfate, which is the material for the ground substance, they end up in a space they make for themselves known as a lacuna, or lacunae in plural. Now, there are three types of cartilage. Once again, the second type is what's known as fiber cartilage. When we break our bones, this is what we would make in the fracture zone as it heals. But we can also find bits of fiber cartilage, say, between neighboring vertebrae in an intervertebral discs, between the two pubic bones in the pubic symphysis. Right. So here's a second type of cartilage known as fiber cartilage. And once again, this can be addressed in the chapter on bone tissue. And then the final type of cartilage is what's known as elastic cartilage. Much more flexible, as you can see here in the external ear. Also a very important piece of elastic cartilage is that of the epiglottis. So every time we swallow, this little piece of cartilage closes over the opening of our airway so that food would not go into our airway. And so we see elastic fibers here, which give it a flexibility. And so cartilage and bone are solid connective tissues with a solid ground substance. Now, blood is also a connective tissue. Now that sounds odd, but it has the three components. There are specialized cells, and they're specialized because one is different from the others. The red blood cells are different from the lymphocytes, which are different from the neutrophils, et cetera. So there are certainly cells here. There are also plasma proteins here. So the fluid of blood has protein, things like albumins, globulins, including antibodies. There are fibrinogen for clotting. And then obviously now something fills in this space. It's watery. And so blood with its specialized cells, its extracellular protein fibers, and its ground substance of water, it is a connective tissue. It's a fluid connective tissue. Lymph would be another example of a fluid connective tissue. Its proteins would be similar to those of blood plasma. Notice here you can see, once again, very specialized cells. Now, sometimes at this point in a semester, some terms are introduced, such as erythrocyte being the word for a red blood cell, leukocyte being the word for white blood cell, etc. But in my lectures, I often don't focus on this until we get to the chapter on blood. And so this is the one thing that all connective tissues have in common. They are composed of these specialized cells, extracellular protein fibers, and this ground substance. Connective tissues make up about half of our bodies. Now, obviously, I don't want to give a percentage. Why? Because one person differs from another, and we vary at different points in our life, from childhood to adulthood. And if you're going to include something like adipose, well, obviously, adipose can change at different points of our lives. There can be gender differences, etc. And so roughly about half of the body's weight is connective tissue, but it includes such different tissues as cartilage and bone on the solid end, blood and lymph on the liquid end, and then a bunch of tissues in between, like the dermis of your skin, lymphatic structures, adipose, and many other connective tissues. Now, at this point, as we kind of leave the topic of connective tissues, before talking about muscle and neural tissue briefly, there's just at this point in the chapter of the text that we use, they introduced the term membrane. Now, membrane is a horrible word in this course, as would say nucleus. And you say, oh, no, that's not true. I know what a nucleus is. Do you really? So what's a nucleus? And if you said, I'm sure you're right. But then you would realize, wait, what kind of nucleus do you mean? Like there's the nucleus of an atom. There's a nucleus of a cell. In the brain, a cluster of soma are called a nucleus. So you have to tell me what nucleus you're talking about before I can define it, because the same word is used for three different structures. Same thing with membrane. What's a membrane? I don't know. Are we talking about the cell membrane, the basement membrane that attaches epithelia to connective tissue, the cutaneous membrane, which is a fancy word for the skin. So the skin is the cutaneous membrane plus hair, etc., or other membranes like mucous membranes. And I'm mentioning it here because a mucous membrane would be made of both epithelia and connective tissue. All right. And we have mucous membranes which are lining the tracts leaving our body. So the digestive tract is lined by mucous membranes, the reproductive tract, the urinary tract, the respiratory tract, etc. And so more in an anatomy and physiology 2 class, you would talk about mucous membranes, the immune presence that they have, the idea that they need to be kept moist, etc. But once again, they are made of both epithelia and connective tissues. Then there are some membranes which are just made of connective tissue. So the term synovial membrane that we'll talk about with our joints, the movable joints are lined by synovial membranes, or these, the serous membranes. So serous membranes include the pericardium around the heart, the pleura around the lungs, peritoneum around the gut. And the reason that they are there is a serous membrane is a double layered bag. There is a parietal layer, which forms a bag around an organ. The visceral layer is actually the surface of the organ itself, the surface of the heart, the surface of the lungs, etc. And then a space forms between them where a lubricating fluid can build up. And that way the heart can always be moving, or the lungs can always be moving, and they're not developing, say, blisters or adhesions to neighboring tissues because of these serous membranes. And so these are appropriately studied in different chapters coming up. You know, obviously the pericardium in the heart, synovial membranes in the chapter on joints, etc. But, you know, since we just mentioned epithelia and connective tissue, you know, I wanted to, you know, just, you know, say that there are different kinds of membranes. So connective tissue makes about half of the body. Epithelium, maybe about 4% of the body. And then as we get into the last two types of tissue, muscle and neural tissue, we can see that muscle makes up about half of the body, and neural tissue, you know, once again, a smaller percentage, about 4% of the body. I'm going to describe muscle and neural tissue here at the end of this video. And some of my students, you know, they might be upset. Wait a minute, you know, you spent, you know, this much time on epithelia, this much time on connective tissue. How come you're rushing muscle and neural tissue? And the answer is, you know, just quite honestly, because they're described in much greater detail in other chapters. There is a chapter in an anatomy and physiology text on muscle tissue. Nervous tissue is the first chapter before you talk about, say, the spinal cord, etc. And so things like muscle and nerve cells, a great deal of time is spent on them. And so at this chapter, where students are just trying to get a handle on what tissues are and the different kinds of tissues, it would be inappropriate to say more than just a couple of introductory things. So let me say a couple of introductory things on muscle, and then leave all, you know, further discussion to the muscle tissue chapter. Very often I'll say to my students, all right, everyone think of a part of your body. Okay, and now try to move it on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, go. And, you know, some move. And I say, all right, you and you. You were thinking of a part of your body that has skeletal muscle in it. The rest of you, we'll talk about you in just a minute. So skeletal muscle is the only muscle you have voluntary control over. If you ever wonder, what type of muscle do I have in this place of my body, try to move it. If it moves, you have skeletal muscle there. Skeletal muscle cells are beautiful to look at under the microscope. They're huge. I mean, they're wide enough to see without a microscope. They can be feet long. And so, you know, they can stretch well beyond the microscope slide. And so that's an easy thing here. I can't see where this muscle begins or ends. It has nuclei, but they tend to be on the periphery of the cell. And there are hundreds of them because there's such big cells. As I had mentioned in a previous video, the way these cells form is that hundreds of little cells called myoblasts smush together and form these huge cylinders, which then can have hundreds of nuclei, resulting from the cells which fused to form them. They have this beautiful set of banding patterns called striations. And when we talk about muscle tissue, these, you know, shows an organization of the proteins, which then are the ones which cause the contraction of muscle. Once again, we have voluntary control over skeletal muscle. We also have involuntary controls. For example, I can move my neck voluntarily. If something were to fall suddenly and make a loud noise, I would have a reflex where I jerk my neck around. So I can both move these muscles voluntarily and involuntarily. When I breathe, I can do that voluntarily, but I can also do it involuntarily while I'm asleep or thinking of other things. So we have both voluntary and involuntary control over skeletal muscle. One other thought is on how it heals. It heals a little bit, not great, but like if I were to damage skeletal muscle, there could be some repair that occurs. But there are different kinds of muscle. Your heart is made of muscle, but it is not voluntary. We cannot voluntarily control our heartbeat. Now, some people say, no, I meditate, I do control my cardiac muscle voluntarily. And the answer is no, you don't. If you could control your cardiac muscle voluntarily, you could say, I love this song. I'm going to have my heart beat along to this song. We can't do that. Now, we can change what hormones we make in our body depending on our mood. So when we're under stress, we make epinephrine. If we relax, we don't. And that this can affect your heart rate. Yes. And it affects lots of things. When I'm under stress, my skeletal muscles, they're contracting as well. That's not what we're talking about with voluntary or involuntary control. So yes, your mood affects your muscles. Yes, that's a good point. But that's not what we mean by voluntary. Cardiac muscle is also striated. You can see that there's a banding pattern here. But these cells are much smaller. They only have one nucleus. It's centrally located, as opposed to having 100 on the outside. And you can see where these cells begin and end. So this thickening here, what's called an intercalated disc, that's where the cell ends and the next cell starts. These intercalated discs are only found in cardiac muscle. And so if you look under a microscope and you see these intercalated discs, that's a defining feature. Cardiac muscle does not regenerate, unfortunately, at all. And so that's a reason we don't want to have a heart attack or a stroke, then, because we lose muscle and we don't get that muscle back. At intercalated discs, we have the cardiac muscle cells fusing. Not only do they have these finger-like extensions which fuse, but we also then have two types of cell junction here. Not only desmosomes, where the cytoskeleton of one cell reaches and attaches to the cytoskeleton of a neighboring cell, but then also there are what are known as gap junctions, which are actually little pores which allow ions to, say, go from one cell into another, helping the cardiac muscle cells to contract as a unit. So those intercalated discs that you see under the microscope, these are sites where we have two specialized junctions, the desmosomes for strength, and then the gap junctions, which allow for communication between the cells. There's a third type of muscle which does not have striations. It has the same proteins as the cardiac and smooth muscle cells, but because these cells taper at the ends, all of the muscle proteins aren't lining up in the same way, and so we don't see that evident banding. The nuclei tend to be elongate, and these are involuntary. So there's lots of things that you can do with your muscles, but you can't do voluntarily. So you can have your hair stand on end, you can have your pupils constrict, but those aren't under voluntary control. Now, the two examples that I just mentioned, having hair stand on end or pupils constrict, these would be things that typically get discussed in Anatomy and Physiology 1. So in Anatomy and Physiology 1, skeletal muscle is the main type of muscle which is described in this course, whereas in the next course, Anatomy and Physiology 2, skeletal muscle is mentioned briefly, like with some sphincters or with chewing, but most of the muscle of AMP2 is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle lines blood vessels. Smooth muscle lines most of the respiratory tract, most of the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, the urinary tract. And so smooth muscle gets some mention in AMP1, but it is the primary type of muscle mentioned in AMP2. And once again, I'm going to move on, not because muscle tissue isn't deserving of more treatment, but because it has its own separate chapter, and this is sufficient for now. And even less attention will be given to nerve cells and neural tissue, because once again, that is dealt with extensively later in the course. There are two types of cells that we find in neural tissue. The ones which we pay most attention to are the neurons. These are nerve cells which are, can be quite large. Most have axons projecting from them, and these axons can extend for feet. So for example, I have nerve cells in the tip of my toe, which then, when they sense that I touch something, send a message all the way up my spinal cord to my medulla. That's a single cell that can be 6 feet long. That's impressive. And they conduct electricity, but how they do that obviously needs some explanation, which is why this is dealt with more extensively in other chapters. Now, neurons are not the only cells found in the nervous system. They're some of the most obvious, but there are also supporting cells known as glia, neuroglia, which actually outnumber the neurons. And so just mentioning, so here, for example, are these ciliated cells, which help to create a current moving the cerebrospinal fluid. They're known as ependymal cells. There are other types of neuroglia. Some perform phagocytosis of microbes. Some wrap neurons in myelin, as in Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. Some create a blood-brain barrier. And so neural tissue has neurons, the nerve cells, the big ones, which get most of the attention, but the neuroglia, the supporting cells, actually outnumber those. Okay, and so that was, just a quick description of the 4 types of tissues in the human adult. Once again, if we were talking about embryos, we talk about embryonic tissues, ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. But epithelia, connective tissue, muscle, and neural tissue, these are the tissues in adults. And once you finish this chapter on tissues, you're now ready to start studying systems. Because if you were going to study an organ like the esophagus, or an organ like the trachea, you would find that, say here, the trachea, it's lined by epithelia, that pseudostratified columnar epithelia. But then you would find cartilage here, that is a connective tissue. There would be a muscle which would allow the trachea to constrict. And so an organ is composed of multiple tissues. Here you see adipose, serving as a packing material and absorbing shock. And so after going through the tissue chapter, you're now ready to study the organs and systems. And then the same would apply to the esophagus here, where we have the serosa, which is epithelia and connective tissue. We have smooth muscle. We have the epithelia of the lining of the esophagus, which is stratified squamous epithelia, adipose, etc. One final thing is that the inflammatory response is best described in the chapter on immunity. But since inflammation affects tissues, this chapter does mention it here as well. So I just want to say a couple things about inflammation. First, when the cells of your body are in trouble, they don't hide this, that cells can release a number of inflammatory signals, which then attract white blood cells to the area. So if you remember, there are mast cells which can be present in, say, the areolar connective tissue, which can release inflammatory signals like histamine, which increase blood flow to an area, and then white blood cells, can come to the area. If there's microbes or debris there, white blood cells can undergo phagocytosis and then sometimes even burst. So at a wound site, you may see pus, and a large degree of that is white blood cells which have undergone phagocytosis, and then destroyed themselves afterwards. Sometimes the white blood cells can send signals to the brain saying that, we're dealing with an infection here. So hypothalamus, could you please raise the temperature of the body so that we can better fight these microbes? So most fevers are actually caused by the body itself. So there is part of the inflammatory response which is meant to seal off the damaged area, maybe with a blood clot, and to bring in white blood cells, which will phagocytize microbes, to bring in more blood, bringing in nutrients. And then the second part of the inflammatory response involves the regeneration of the tissues. Now, very often there are growth factors released. So for example, when platelets start a blood clot, they release growth factors, causing more cell division in the cells around them. And if an area which is damaged is small, And cells in that tissue can regenerate. And as I've said, say smooth muscle regenerates rather well, whereas say cardiac muscle doesn't. Epithelial cells, they regenerate well. You could then actually get the tissue returning to its normal form and function. But as you can see here, this is cardiac muscle in this first side, but then after a heart attack, these are the cells of scar tissue afterwards. And so that would include collagen fibers, fibroblasts, and the like. Sometimes a tissue doesn't regenerate. Say in cardiac muscle, the tissue really doesn't regenerate. Neural tissue doesn't regenerate to appreciable degrees. And then sometimes even if skin does regenerate well, if I had a burn over much of my arm, that would just be too big of an area. And so if you look on the left, this is what normal heart tissue looks like. The tissue on the right is scar tissue. Now, it's good that the scar tissue is there, that the collagen fibers which are there are stitching the area together, sealing it off. That's good. But it doesn't have the same function that the original tissue did. It doesn't have muscle which can contract. You know, the scar tissue that might form after an extensive burn, that doesn't have sweat glands or hair, for example. And so in the regeneration of a tissue, sometimes we see fibrosis where the scar tissue which results does not have the functionality of the original tissue. So that's a conclusion of the tissues of the body. The second half, there was a previous video on epithelium.